I like the devil. And no, I'm not referring to the belief held by a devil worshiper or a Satanist. I mean, when it comes to stories that include the concept of the devil or Lucifer, I personally think that's a cool archetype to have within a story. When a series, manga, or cartoon is playing with these narrative concepts, it always excites me to see how this series is going to innovate this portrayal in their own way. Even though I'm Catholic, I don't like to hold the belief of any attempt to portray Satan in a different light from what he's known for to be considered demonic propaganda. Stories are messages from the minds of all human beings, shaped by their thoughts and opinions with the ability to transform and captivate an audience's mind, allowing them to be casted into a new world different from their own. The way I see it, these stories are tools shaped by humans, made for humans to connect to whatever experiences we witness. That connection is something I believe everyone yearns for, with said stories having different messages being told. As someone who believes in the Christian faith, I feel like you should be more than able to take certain aspects from the Bible and incorporate them in any way you want to tell a story that conveys your message, no matter how I personally feel about it. When it comes to the media depiction of Lucifer from the Bible, there's a wide spectrum in how different series interpret him. My favorite recent example is Netflix's show Lucifer, which was loosely based on a DC comic book run featuring the same character. One of the constant criticisms I saw from the other Christians was that this show was just an attempt from the devil to lead humanity away from God by making himself a more sympathetic figure so people could connect with. The way I saw it, the show was an attempt to take a widely known character and give the audience the ability to relate to him, not to condone his actions, but to understand if the devil can change, so can you. The risk of using said controversial character to be put in a position is what I believe is the true capability of storytelling, to change the status quo with a high risk and reward as a true test to artistry and skill. When I first heard about Hazbin Hotel back when the pilot dropped on YouTube, besides Alistair, the character I was most interested in, given the show takes place in hell, was how they was going to depict Lucifer himself. And with watching season 1 and 2, I'm convinced that Vivziepop doesn't know what she's doing with the character, and it pains me because I do understand where she's going with, but she lacks the ability to execute on the concept she wants. With that, Lucifer has been the most annoying character to watch among the 2 seasons, and I want to talk about it. Before we start talking about my frustration with Lucifer's characterization in season 1 and 2, we need to talk about the pilot. And if your first reaction is that Lucifer wasn't in the pilot, well, you're simply wrong. But to start, the pilot is non-canon at the moment, until Vivziepop decides to head us with a retcon of hell. Until then, the events and notable takeaways from the pilot simply doesn't line up with the story of season 1 and season 2 of Hazbin Hotel. So why even talk about it in the first place? For me, the pilot introduced certain concepts that Vivziepop was experimenting with at the time, which led me to conclude that Lucifer was intended to be a very different character from what we've seen in season 1 and season 2. This is going to be a repeat of what I said in an earlier video in which I revisited Hazbin Hotel with certain criticisms I developed after rewatching it. I mentioned that the dynamic between Lucifer and Charlie was flipped on its axis in the pilot, with the pilot suggesting that Lucifer found Charlie to be a disappointment to the legacy he wanted her to carry on following in his footsteps. In the main series, however, the opposite happens, where we have Lucifer feeling the disappointment and doesn't want Charlie to be like him, which causes him to distance himself from her. With scenes that contain songs like this and storylines like that.
Don't worry, I picked up one thing from my dad. You don't take shit from other demons.
Gave me the impression that Lucifer was going to be some sort of antagonist that Charlie would have to overcome. So heading into season 1, I felt dissatisfied to the expectation I set for myself for the character. And after watching season 1 and 2, I came with this question, which is, what is the purpose of Lucifer's character? Within the very first scenes of the series, we're introduced to the story of the fall of the Morningstar as told by Charlie, with Lucifer taking the role as a misunderstood character. He is portrayed as being punished for the actions he committed with his bride, Lilith, the first act of disobedience, giving Eve the gift of free will, which allowed evil and sin to enter humanity and disrupt the order that heaven had maintained. This perspective of Lucifer clearly paints him as the victim of the story, cast out of heaven and sent to hell for the crime of believing he could help with his own ideas. He is described as a troublemaker, with his ideas seen as too bold and brash for heaven to implement. This sets up heaven as an allegory for a traditional system that is resistant to change, fearful of new ideas, and threatened by anything that challenges the way it already operates. Naturally, this depiction of Lucifer and other biblical concepts that the show used sparked controversy, the biggest takeaway being that heaven has to be corrupt, with them being seen as the antagonists for the series. At this moment of the video, hold this idea since we're going to circle back to this topic later on. The story of the fall of Lucifer was something I believe to show his side of what happened, that the true account of the series of events would be revealed later down in the series. And with Vivziepop's comment online, I don't think that's the case anymore. So what is the narrative attempt here? Well, Vivziepop tries to set up Lucifer as this tragic character that was wrongfully condemned by a whole system that wasn't designed for people like him. Lucifer, being a heavily outcast, got casted out of heaven for what he believed at the time to be the right thing to do, not realizing the greater harm he brought. This is of course similar to the original sin, when Eve partook in the fruit of forbidden knowledge, an action that went against God's wishes and led to her and Adam to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden. With being tricked by the serpent, Eve was convinced to second guess God's word, believing instead what the serpent presented as true. The main difference is that when Eve and Adam partook of the apple, they became aware of the moral concept of sin. Lucifer and Lilith gave humanity the gift of free will, allowing people to choose between moral and immoral actions throughout their lives. With Lucifer now crowned as king of hell and given his own kingdom, the place where the worst of humanity resides and where the most sinful, depraved, and cruel acts takes place under his authority, he was tasked to carry out his duties as a king alongside his wife and Queen Lilith for eternity. As a constant reminder of his failure, he's constantly shown what these sinners have done with the gift of free will, the power to choose their own faith, and they, on their own volition, chose depravity, and he was disgusted by it. With the final nail of the coffin being that in a place where he's the most powerful, in a place where change is needed, the person with the power and authority to change it can't. Lucifer, being the bringer of free will, can't use his own free will to change the landscape of hell, having no true authority to punish sinners. And in the act of punishment, when he failed to comply, he was forced in a position where all he could do is watch. Hell isn't a kingdom for him to rule, it's a prison for its strongest prisoner. And that's Lucifer, a story of a dreamer who got his dreams crushed. I feel like this was Vivziepop's attempt at writing Lucifer, a new take on the devil from the Bible, going into a different direction. This could have worked, hell, it should have worked, but it didn't. And that's because of how the story has unfolded within the events of season 1 and 2. As I said before, Hazbin Hotel has good concepts, but the series has shown itself unable to consistently follow through on what it's introducing in the story. When it comes to the king of hell himself, I want to ask this question: do you think Lucifer is prideful? Because I don't, and that's the main issue. But before I tackle that, we need to ask ourselves, what is pride and why is it bad? First, we have the act of having pride, the feeling of being confident and self-assured in one's abilities or identity, which brings an appropriate confidence that we all need to navigate life. Then there's having pride in others, a sense of connection with another individual, respecting their achievement and accomplishment within the scope of community. And finally, there's the sin of pride, an infatuated sense of confidence that can lead a person to become disillusioned with the reality they're facing. The sin of pride is designed to lead a person astray from what they actually can accomplish, often causing frustration when they fail to achieve an unexpected outcome. Pride is a dangerous game that always haunted humanity across different cultures and religion. A classic example is the story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun believing he could reach the heavens, only for his rings to melt and for him to fall to his death. The thing about pride compared to the other 6 deadly sins is that, in my view, pride is connected to all of them, being the root of all of them. And when it comes to Lucifer and Hazbin Hotel, I don't think he embodies pride, and I find that very problematic. If we take the story of his fall from heaven as true, how did Lucifer commit the sin of pride, when the story currently paints him as being right and heaven being in the wrong? Since pride is unjustified confidence, if Lucifer's actions were justified, then it isn't pride at that point. What makes it worse is that, through his characterization so far, if Vivian wanted to take the approach of Lucifer not being evil in its traditional sense, not being a series villain, that's fine, but you can't refer to him as the king or the embodiment of the sin of pride without actually making him prideful. Based on what the story has given us so far, Lucifer isn't prideful, he's just correct. Back when he was in heaven, his ideas weren't bad, they were simply misunderstood by his peers. The gift of free will wasn't a mistake, but a greater overall good that no one recognized at the time. The ability to allow a person to change based on their own choices. The story Vivziepop created, to me, seems to baby Lucifer in his portrayal, casting him as the victim of heaven's cruel system. If you want to see someone go into great detail on the fictional portrayal of sin as the embodiment of an immoral concept, Crusader Wolf made an excellent video a few months back, you should check it out. And what makes it worse is that the story itself doesn't seem committed to heaven being the active corrupt ruling class. So after the events of season 2, it's clear that heaven as a whole wouldn't function as an antagonist in a narrative sense, with the vast majority of their residents being unaware of their exterminations taking place in hell, and with Sarah, the person with the most authoritative position besides the speaker of God and God themselves. It just feels like no one knows how to run heaven. They don't know the parameters of a soul being qualified to join heaven, the concept of a sinner being redeemed is alien to them, and with everything else in between seems like an even giant mess. yes, what I want to focus on is the quote-unquote system of heaven and how they went about punishing Lucifer. The reason I believe Lucifer's inability to punish sinners doesn't work because of how this could obviously bite heaven in the ass eventually. We have the most powerful person in hell being unable to exercise any real authority or control, and yet he's expected to govern the most violent, cruel, and chaotic kingdom, one that even heaven fears. Since the fall of Lucifer, hell's uprising wasn't an if, it was only a when. By restricting Lucifer from enacting any sort of violence on the sinners, it should be obvious that since he's surrounded by humanity's most spiteful, cunning, and vindictive members, someone will eventually find out his secret. And without a backup plan in case this happens, the situation where Vox discovering Lucifer can't harm them was always bound to occur. And what makes this more confusing is that while Lucifer is apparently unable to harm Vox or the rest of the sinners, he's more than capable of harming Adam, a high-ranking angel in heaven, and the first person to join heaven. And if your first reaction is, well, Lucifer just can't harm sinners, not winners, well, who's the dumbass in heaven who made that distinction? We saw in season 1 where Adam verbally explains how he's coming to Charlie's hotel, the same hotel that Lucifer put a party on protecting Charlie in prior exterminations, meaning that Adam was aware that he was forbidden to attack the hotel since Lucifer, as a fallen angel, still maintaining some level of connection and influence, as we saw when he arranged a meeting for Charlie. This naturally raised the question of why wouldn't Adam be aware of the possibility of Lucifer coming down to protect his daughter? He quite literally switches from knowing he can't harm Charlie to openly threatening her. So again, it only makes sense that her father, being the most powerful person in hell, will protect her. That should be a simple train of thought for Adam to be aware of since he's the first human to ever join heaven. So he should be already aware of Lucifer's condition of what he can or cannot do. The only reason I'm this critical of heaven in this video is due to the fact that every personal problem I have with heaven and how they're being portrayed in the story is a direct reflection of Lucifer's character. Heaven is the entire reason why Lucifer got casted out in the first place. And to understand Lucifer, I have to understand the system of heaven and its people and its culture that allowed Lucifer to eventually fall. And looking at heaven for what it is right now, it just simply doesn't make sense to me. I really want to like Lucifer, but these 2 seasons so far haven't steered me in the direction I hoped for. And hopefully season 3 could fix this, but that's something we have to wait and see. With Charlie's family taking more of a center stage, with Lilith hopefully being more involved in the storyline, there's still a chance that Lucifer as a character can surprise me. But how do you feel about Vivian's take on Lucifer? Do you agree with what I said, or am I just wrong? Because I hope I'm wrong. Tell me your thoughts in the comment section down below. Until next time, I'm your host Taken, and we do a little reviewing around here. Peace out.